Hello, I'm Linda Churchill. I am grateful to Palliative Manitoba and to Cropo Funeral Chapel for inviting me to offer this presentation on preparing for the holidays. I am a local marriage and family therapist. I have run several bereavement support groups over the years that I've been practicing, and I am grateful to every single participant for teaching and deepening my knowledge of the grief experience. And so I hope that this presentation will be helpful in some small measure to help you get ready for the holidays. First of all, I'd like to start by lighting an in memoriam candle. This is something that I typically do at the beginning of every session of a bereavement support groups, and I'd like to light one now in loving memory of our deceased loved ones. Grief, by its very nature, is a relational matter. We have relationships. We have relationships of love. And when people die, we naturally mourn their loss. We grieve their loss because grief and love are two sides of the same coin. If we never love, we will never grieve. But who wants to live a lifeless and loveless life? Actually, a loveless life is probably a lifeless life. So yes, grief is the price we pay for having loved. Grief also is a natural, normal human experience. Perhaps it isn't just humans, perhaps even animals mourn the loss of loved ones as well. Grief is our system's natural way of dealing with pain. It needs to move through us, it needs to flow. And the kinder and gentler we are with our grief, the kinder and gentler our grief will be with us. So, why are the holidays so problematic for those of us who are grieving the loss of loved ones? Well, first of all, it's typically a time of family and friends and celebrating, but what if the one you want to celebrate with isn't around anymore? So that is cause for deep grief and great sadness. Another thing is that holidays are typically a time of celebrating. Well, loss and grief by their very nature don't exactly put us in a celebratory mood. So it makes sense just not to have that kind of energy to go through the holidays with any measure of joy. Although I will say that sometimes there can be moments of joy in spite of the sadness for some people. It could be a time also of holidays where we're going to miss our deceased loved one or loved ones more than usual. Why? Typically, I don't know about COVID times, who knows, but typically it is a time of gathering. It is a time of reuniting. It is a time of reconnecting. So all the more the reason to feel some pain because the one you really want to be with isn't around. The irony of the holidays when it comes to grief is that it's a busy time for many people. For those of us who grieve the loss of loved ones, a time when we need the most support may be the time when we get the least of it because people are preoccupied with their own preparations, their own celebrations. So, what are some ways we might incorporate our loss into the holidays? Because I think the most authentic thing when we're mourning the loss of a loved one is to keep it real, to be authentic, to be, to not avoid or deny the reality that we're sad. We're not feeling wonderful right now. And that makes perfect sense in light of what we've gone through. So we lean into the grief. We don't run away from it. It's actually not grief we're avoiding. That's rather inevitable. It's the pain. So if we can find ways to be with the pain. Grief is an internal experience that needs to flow through us. To be with the pain sometimes is all we can do to be with the sadness. I like to think that if we can sit with sadness, which is one of the harder emotions to sit with, many bereavement group members have said they'd rather be angry than sad. Um, Anger is a very powerful emotion, it's energetic and all that. But sadness is a different kind of energy and it's hard to be with. If we simply sit with sadness in its purest form, it's actually easier than sitting with all the things that go with sadness, such as the thought, oh, I wish I were over it by now. I wish I didn't have to go through this. I wish I could teleport myself 5 years from now so I don't have to go through this. I'm done with this. I don't want to be sad anymore. There's always, I call them feelings about the feelings. If we can be with sadness, if we can be with our difficult emotions, and in some ways it's kind of like a very friendly posture. I like the RAIN acronym by Dr. Tara Brock. RAIN stands for, when it comes to our difficult emotions, or perhaps even our pleasant ones, recognize the experience that we're having, the emotion that we're having, recognize it. And then A stands for acknowledge it. I'm sad. I recognize this feeling. It is sadness. I investigate with curiosity and care. Investigate the sadness. And then N, nurture with compassion. In other words, be a solid friend to ourselves. Be a kind, generous, non judgmental, compassionate friend to ourselves. Another helpful tip is to externalize the grief. I've heard many people say that helps them feel a bit lighter, a bit less burdened, if you will. Now, by externalize, I mean to make external that which is internal. So I'll give you an example. When I lit that candle, and the memory candle, that's a way of externalizing that our loving memories of our loved ones, our deceased loved ones, can be externalized as in a symbol, the lit candle. That can be done, for example, around the table. If there's a dinner, a family gathering of sorts, it's perfectly legitimate to light a memory candle and offer a moment of silence. Or perhaps if you have a religious tradition, to offer a prayer, mentioning the loved one in that prayer. And for those people who do have um, religious connections, asking the spiritual leader of a given faith community to offer prayers in loving memory of your deceased loved one or loved ones, and acknowledging the loss of their survivors might also prove helpful. Some people, to externalize their grief, might create an online tribute. Perhaps they might invite a few people over and say, especially if it involves people who knew that loved one, to say, listen, let's share stories and memories about, Auntie Dorothy or Uncle Paul or our brother or whoever it is that you're grieving. That has a number of can be helpful in a number of ways. One is that you open the door to being able to just talk about it, to be free. It's probably the elephant. The loss is probably the elephant in the room anyway. Might as well just say it out loud, and let there be permission to talk about the loved one, to share stories, to reminisce. For some families, for some people, that's enormously helpful. There can be perhaps if there's a donation that you might make to the loved one's favorite organization or charity, that's one way to externalize a memory of the loved one and to make meaning out of it as well. I recall back in the day, I don't know about COVID times, but if memory serves, Palliative Manitoba would feature a memory tree in one of the local shopping malls where people could perhaps make a donation to Palliative Manitoba, a marvelous organization, and put something on the tree in loving memory of their deceased loved one, which I think is a lovely way. There's more than one organization, I think, that does that sort of thing. However, and I do think it's a wonderful way, again, to externalize. Yet another way to externalize is to maybe have a memento or ornament, if you have ornaments in your tradition, uh, to put them in a prominent spot, whether it's on a fireplace mantelpiece or around on the dining room table or someplace that might sort of show recognition and honor of that deceased loved one. And also the relationship that you've had with them and continue to have with their memory. There are a number of other ways to cope and prepare for the holidays. For example, having a plan A or a plan B. Um, so, for example, say someone invites you to some kind of uh, holiday event, mm, whatever, let's see what COVID does. But anyway, I digress. So, let's say you get invited to something. And then as the event draws near, you realize, I just don't have the energy to do this. I just don't want to go. You have the human right to say no. You have the human right to graciously decline. You can say something like, I would normally love to go, but I'm just not up for it this year. Ask me again next year. I'm sure I'll feel better then. Perfectly legitimate to do that. Or, for example, if someone suggests that you carpool going to an event and you're not so sure you can handle the whole thing, you might say, if you have wheels of your own, you might say, no, I think I'll just go on my own because I'm not going to stay long. You know, own your grief experience, own it, take care of yourself, be a really good friend to yourself at this time. And if you have to leave early, leave early. It's perfectly legitimate. Now, another radical idea, I don't recommend if you have children. It's not even another radical idea, it's one radical idea, but I don't recommend it again with children, and that is to cancel the holidays. They'll come around again next year. It's perfectly legitimate to say, I'm going to sit this one out. I just don't have the energy for this right now, and so I'm going to cancel, and maybe next year. Now, with children, if there are children and or grandchildren, my recommendation would be a good enough Christmas. Good enough. So maybe instead of making, 12 dozen cookies, you might just make a couple of dozen. You might not really decorate the house. You might, or maybe put up some small, simple token of a decoration. A good enough Christmas. Don't go all out. Just do what you can to get away with it. And that would be sufficient. That would be perfectly sufficient. Um, Children and grandchildren probably won't mind and won't notice. And in fact, it's another way to demonstrate or at least embody healthy grieving. It's okay to say to children and or grandchildren who may also be mourning the loss, depending on the nature of their relationship with the deceased. It's okay to say, it's okay to be sad. If you're sad, if you miss them, I miss them too. Let's be sad together. And you can still have a decent time while moving through the sadness and allowing the sadness to move through you. Some do's and don'ts around grieving. Well, first of all, if it's been said earlier that we need to be kind and gentle. Do be kind, gentle, and protective of yourself and your energy at this time. Actually, grieving can be very tiring too, can sap a lot of energy. So it's really a time to take good care, to get enough sleep, proper hydration, proper nourishment, as much time as we need to just take care of ourselves. Another thing is don't do more than you can. Don't do more than you want to do. If ever there was a time to be, I call it enlightened self-interest, now would be the time to practice enlightened self-interest. I think most people know that at a very deep level anyway. Do allow time to feel what you feel. Why hide it? Why deny it? Why suppress it? When you think of the last time you had a good laugh, for example, it went in a wave, right? It came up, it peaked, it subsided. Most of our emotional states are like that. They arise, they peak, they subside. So that's what our grief bursts will be about. Actually, some people tell me that during the holidays, they are surprised by even having bursts of joy where something breaks through the sadness. It could be it could be the smell of something delicious. It could be the sight of a child laughing, opening up a gift. It could be a piece of music that just brings joy. You never know where these moments will come from, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all grief during the holidays. We just need to be open. But we need to take time to feel what we feel. Sometimes, if we're at an event, for example, we might need to take time to go into the washroom and compose ourselves. Just take a bit of a time out and breathe, let the emotions come and go. As David Kessler says, emotions need motion. Another don't would be don't keep feelings bottled up inside. Um, Cry as much as you need to cry. You know, if you have 1,000 tears, don't just shed 500. Also says David Kessler. Um, like I said, emotions will have a crescendo and they will subside. I remember someone once said, "Well, if I start crying, I'll never stop." Well, actually, no. The tears do come to a terminus. They do end. Also, do allow others to help. If people offer, take it. Take it. People want to be helpful. Oftentimes, we want to be helpful, but we don't always know how to be helpful. And so sometimes it's good to ask, how can I be helpful? What can I say or do right now would be super helpful to you? If it's a neighbor who's strong and able-bodied and you're just not up for shoveling the driveway, you might say, well, I wouldn't mind it if you shoveled the driveway. I'm just not up for it right now. Or I wouldn't mind it if Johnny could have a play date with Julie because I'm just, I'm sure Julie is tired of seeing me mope around. Little things. I'll never forget a time when our family was going through loss, and it was during the holidays. A lovely, lovely community member that we knew brought over a delicious homemade tourtière, French Canadian meat pie. And oh, it was just lovely, a lovely gesture on her part and a delicious treat for our family at a time when we didn't really much feel like cooking. So things to keep in mind. Actually, if we reach out to others who we think are having a difficult experience or perhaps going through their own grief, that can also help make us feel a little bit better. Anytime we make connections that are meaningful with others, that goes a long way in helping us to heal. Another thing is about children. Um, Children don't show their grief the same way as adults do. But make no mistake, if a child has had a relationship with a deceased loved one, they probably need permission to talk about it or do something else. So, for example, it's been said the child's first language is play. So, anytime you play with a child, you're speaking in that child's first language, and the child will say what they need to say. Or, for example, you could say something like, I'm sad about Grandpa dying. It's okay to be sad. Do you feel sad too? It's okay to miss Grandpa. I do too. It's all right. Get it out in the open, and you also model for that child a healthy grief, healthy grieving. So holidays tend to be the most difficult parts of the bereavement process, and the way we handle them tends to be probably as unique as we are as individuals. I often say no two grievers are the same. We're rather like Canadian snowflakes. Snowflakes, no two are alike. And so we must honor that we grieve in character. Some of us are very expressive in our grieving, and some of us are a bit more private and reserved about our grieving. That must be respected. No two people grieve alike. And also, in one's cultural or religious traditions, there might be some wonderful things to investigate in terms of what culture and religion can offer to somebody people who are a part of those communities. Also something to consider in preparation for the holidays. if grief is allowed to move through us and we move through grief, we can get through it. We can get through it, this very natural way to heal through loss. There are other sorts of tips. For example, no thanks is a complete sentence, and that can suffice. Thanks for thinking of me. I'm going to decline this time, as I said earlier, but also in the face of some unhelpful comments that people unwittingly make. Nobody wants to be unhelpful, but it happens sometimes. We can say something like, I appreciate your concern. I know it comes from a good place. Or I appreciate your care. Or I appreciate your consideration. I know it comes from a good place. So those are just a few ideas about preparing for the holidays. And I hope that it's been helpful in some measure. I would have preferred to have been with you in person. I recall Cropo has a lovely meeting space, a really good meeting space for presentations that also promote group conversation if the situation warrants. That can't happen right now. So here we are with a recording. But I send this with very good wishes and wishing you all a blessed season. Thank you once again to Palliative Manitoba and to Cropo Funeral Chapels.